Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry, Peter Shannon, and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
Slow nature by which we in aviation adopt new technology because we are so much programmed toward zero tolerance for error. And that's not to say that we need to accept more risk on the commercial side. I mean, it is a pretty good feeling that when you step onto an aircraft in the US or in Europe, you have the best probability of getting to where you're going safely than any other form of transportation that humankind has ever come up with. I mean, that's a good feeling. We wouldn't want anything to disturb that. But any time that you introduce something new that has any type of risk, that risk has to be looked at and mitigated to the greatest extent possible. And we're in just a new world. And so the regulators don't move quickly in that environment, not nearly as fast as the Congress or the industry would like them to.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Vertical Space, and thanks again for all of your support. We hope you enjoyed our last podcast on the talk we gave at Honeywell's Advanced Air Mobility Summit in DC in July. So we heard today's guest, Pete Bunce, speak at that Honeywell Summit, and as he always is, he was a standout. And it's for those same reasons that we were delighted that Pete joined us on The Vertical Space. As most of you know, Pete is the president and CEO of GAMA, the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. So there's a number of reasons why you may find this podcast special. What stood out for me is that Pete is the perfect blend of a deep understanding of both established aviation with advanced air mobility, with a special combination of raw competence, regulatory understanding, industry knowledge, and knowing how to get things done. Listen to Pete's vision for the challenges, opportunities, practical realities of how advanced air mobility will be integrated into our traditional transportation infrastructure, and the value we may realize after that integration. Listen, Pete is a national treasure and a great industry leader. Pete, thanks for joining us on the podcast. And to our guests, enjoy our talk with Pete Bunce as you innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by Avionics. Avionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let Avionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. Avionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace.
Pete Bunce is the president and CEO of the General Aviation Manufacturers Association. Pete joined GAMA in 2005. GAMA promotes general aviation and advances the interest of its global membership of more than 140 airframe, avionics, engine, and component manufacturers, as well as the world's leading business aviation maintenance, repair, and overhaul companies. Pete served in the United States Air Force for 26 years, and his last assignment prior to his retirement was as the director of the Air Force Congressional Budget Appropriations Liaison. Pete is an active pilot with more than 7,500 hours in military fighter and trainer aircraft, as well as civil piston, turboprop, and business jet aircraft. He holds the FAA Airline Transport Certificate and seaplane rating. Pete is a member of the FAA's 13-member Management Advisory Council. Additionally, Pete serves as both the FAA's Next Gen Advisory Committee, MITRE Corporation Aviation Advisory Committee, and the NASA Advisory Council Aeronautics Committee. The Living Legends of Aviation named Pete the 2007 Aviation Industry Leader of the Year. In 2009, he was awarded the ICAS Sword of Excellence. In 2010, he was inducted into the 70 Living Legends of Aviation. In 2022, he was inducted into the Wisconsin Aviation Hall of Fame, and the National Aeronautical Association presented him with the McDonnell Distinguished Statesman of Aviation Award. Pete Bunce, it's a great honor to have you on The Vertical Space. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm very glad to be here.
So, Pete, we asked the first question of all of our guests, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
I think it would be how you define very few. I think if you look at general aviation and business aviation, we're pretty much in lockstep with with all of our other sister associations and everything. Where I think we would get some great disagreement is all of my friends in the airline community about the role of technology in moving forward. It's been very disheartening to me that there is so much resistance to common sense use of technology as we move forward, automation, and you can't stop the march of technology. And there is a union position that is being taken that very much wants to disavow where technology can take us and what it can do for us. And if you look at current errors in the system, accidents, whether they're accidents, incidents, mishaps, a lot of the close calls that we're seeing that the FAA is focusing on right now, they're based on human error. And as much as I don't ever want to be replaced by a computer or a robot flying an aircraft, the march of technology is what it is. And a lot of the arguments that you're hearing out of the airline community are just the same arguments they used when we went to 4-3 and 3-2 in the cockpit. And it just doesn't make sense, especially some of the negative comments that we saw in the advanced air mobility responses to the FAA's NPRM process from the airline unions that are just archaic in their thinking. And also, we're talking about trying to do a set of rulemaking that applies to aircraft that are, 4-passenger to 6-passenger, everything. And for someone to think that those aircraft, with being so highly automated, require more than one pilot or require dual controls in the training is just an archaic way of doing things. And that's not where we've gone in the military. And it's very frustrating.
Pete, can you give us a few other examples of this archaic thinking about the potential of technology to improve aviation?
Well, it's just like if we, think about an ocean crossing. We've been working with EASA and a lot of our companies to be able to, instead of having to have an augmented crew up there, when you're at cruise and you can have a virtual co-pilot or you can have automation be able to help you out versus the very expensive cost without, in my mind, any safety benefit that you have having to carry extra crews, especially when you're just droning along and talking on the radio. Why we can't move in that direction is extremely frustrating and short-sighted.
If we take the lesson from the past, you mentioned this initial resistance in decreasing the crew in the cockpit. How did industry ultimately win this argument, and how was it able to change the minds of all of the skeptics around? And does that inform us about this new chapter in aviation?
I think you just argue it on a safety case. And, when you have a organization that is out there always claiming that they're the largest safety organization in the world, but then they don't at all acknowledge the safety that's brought by advanced technology, eventually that argument's just going to wear out. And people with common sense are going to look at it and say, no, that's not true. We can be safer if we employ more technology in the cockpit to be able to take care of a lot of the human error issues that come to rise out there. And I'm not saying that we're going to see large commercial aircraft, probably in my professional career, ever go to one pilot with a virtual co-pilot at the side, but there are definite applications with smaller aircraft where we do a risk-based proportional approach to the rulemaking that would allow for, at the appropriate point in time, one pilot up front.
Give us a little bit of your perspective on advanced air mobility.
Well, we saw advanced air mobility coming when we actually worked the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act. And we built into both Part 23 and CS 23, where there was tremendous cooperation between the FAA and EASA and several other authorities around the planet to be able to look at how we do small aircraft with the whole thought in mind that we would be able to capitalize on what we saw coming in this revolution and evolution in aviation with electric and hybrid propulsion. And so we built that in there. And simultaneously, we created at GAMA an associate membership category, because up till that point, the only way that you could be a member of GAMA is actually to have a certified product. And we thought that it would make sense not only for these entrepreneurial companies, but also for our traditional aviation manufacturers that would be a part of this growing new segment of aviation, to get them all together and have them work together like our traditional GAMA companies do. I've always been so impressed about when they get in a room, all these competitors that compete very fiercely out in the marketplace all work to advance the industry, and all boats rise at high tide, and they really take that attitude, and competitors are friends when they're in a GAMA meeting. And we wanted to try to build that same ethos of camaraderie and cooperation with these new AAM companies. So we created our what we call the Electric Propulsion Innovation Committee. And I think we started off with about 16 members, and now it's our largest committee, and we have over 110 members of the committee. And we allow the associate members, they're required once they do get certified, then to become a regular member. But by getting them all to work together toward common purpose has been, in my mind, tremendous to be able to help this community along and to be able to speak with one voice as we go and work with the regulators, which, as you know, are taking a different approach in Europe versus in the US. And even within those regulatory schemes, they've thrown us some curveballs in the last few years, and we've had to deal with it as an industry as a whole. But it's exciting for me to be able to see this evolution in aviation. And as I always speak to what's happening right now, this has to be what it was like during the dawn of the jet age, when things were happening so quickly, so many different designs coming out. And just looking at technology and the potential for it is so exciting.
So back at let's say the dawn of the jet age, do you think there was a general impression that people understood what the value of the jet would be? We were even talking in a recent podcast, one in fact we released today, where the comments the three of us made at the Honeywell Summit about a month ago. And we mentioned that even when the airplane came about with the Wright brothers, there was a question as to what do you do with this thing? What's going to be the value of this thing they call an airplane? Is it your general impression there's a pretty solid understanding as to what the value of these 100 plus companies that are part of your committee, the value advanced air mobility is going to give to industry? What's your general take on that?
No, I think that we're scratching the surface of people that actually know about it, have actually looked into the potential. And depending on who you talk to, everybody's got a little bit different angle about where this is going to be a value proposition, how the business case is going to close for a lot of these companies. Because we originally called it urban air mobility, and very quickly, with some good advice from legislators up on Capitol Hill, they said, well, what about rural America? How do these aircraft support rural America? And if you think about it, with the cutback of essential air service to a lot of communities that have been affected very severely by the cutback in their services to be able to get to a hub to fly somewhere long range, as we increase the range of these advanced air mobility vehicles, you can think of scenarios where it really does help rural communities. And then you think about eventually where we have vehicles sitting in the local firehouse, whether it's a volunteer firehouse or a paid one, that are pre-programmed to go to a trauma center or burn center if somebody gets hurt, with a nurse or a paramedic on board, and they fly autonomously over to the burn center. I mean, this will change society as we proved in Iraq and Afghanistan, if we get people to medical care within that golden hour after their injury, we can save lives. And so if we look at it from that perspective, then we go into the cities. There's been a lot of conversation. What happens when a local community starts to look at these vehicles for mass transit versus just people with means being able to pay whatever the fee would be to avoid traffic jams, and that they're actually established routes that allow anybody to be able, at a very affordable price, to be able to travel with these like you would a bus or a metro line. the potential is tremendous. And then you go to the CTOL, take short takeoff and landing type of vehicles. And we're talking about doing some things with distributed propulsion that really make landing very, very short distances. So now our society has moved away from a lot of big malls. Some of the big malls are dying, but there's a lot of asphalt and concrete there that could be used to have these very short takeoff and landing aircraft that can haul goods and services and that. So again, there's just so many tentacles and aspects of advanced air mobility that are exciting above and beyond just the urban air mobility piece. And it's, of course, on the fixed wing side, or the traditional take the Aviation type of platform there that looks like a business jet, but just has two electric engines on the back of the aircraft. You think about that in noise sensitive areas or areas that really are focusing heavily on sustainability footprints, like up in the Scandinavian countries, for instance. The potential is absolutely giant. So I am extremely excited about all of these different aspects and trying to explain to people that it's just not this one lone urban air mobility case, that there's just so much more to it. I think we're just scratching the surface of the public's understanding of it. And the other part of it that people always ask is, well, will the public accept it? And I think as these aircraft start to come into the airspace in the US and in Europe, young people are flying these aircraft because they know that the regulatory bodies have a safety function out there, and these aircraft are safe. And I think young people will adapt to it much more quickly than perhaps some older people. But when we think about what we do every day, when we go through any big airport right now, we're jumping on trams that are totally autonomous and traveling at speeds that if it crashed, people would get seriously hurt. And we don't even think about it. And I think that's actually what will happen over time as we introduce these vehicles and prove the safety case.
Can we spend some time talking about general aviation broadly? And if you don't mind taking us back to even the post-World War II era and the rise in general aviation fleets and then the subsequent decline, what were the underlying drivers of this evolution, and how is it shifting today, if at all?
Well, we come out of World War II and we've got, this plethora of aviators that have very much saw the utility of flying and love to be in the air. But also you had all of this technology that was developed during World War II that was waiting to be unleashed in the civil sector. So you saw a tremendous number of companies arise in the 50s and the 60s. And then it was, as we get into the 70s, the amount of aircraft that were actually built and produced was just tremendous. I mean, I could only dream that our industry could produce that many aircraft now. And maybe with these advanced air mobility machines, we can get back to those types of production rates. But what happened, obviously, as we got more into the 70s is the litigious society that we live in the U.S. And the U.S. has always been, since World War II, the major market in the world, because we have this incredible network of airfields across the entire nation that no country can even come close to replicating. I mean, we built these airfields, every small community, and we figured out that we could connect communities via air, and we didn't. We kind of sunsetted in a lot of ways the railroad network. Obviously, we still use it a lot for freight rail, but a passenger rail network is just almost impossible to create cost effectively in this country now, just because of land values and everything else. You can't condemn property like they do in China and build high-speed rail networks. And so we have this great infrastructure out there. But then all of a sudden, in the litigiousness that we have in this country, it really threatened this entire industry. And that was how GARA came about, the General Aviation Revitalization Act. And that was led by Senator Dole, no surprise, from Kansas. And being the home of the air capital of the world, Russ Meyer and Senator Dole worked very closely together to craft this legislation because Russ was very willing to get out of the light GA marketplace at that time because of the liability concerns that were out there. GAMA, working very closely with AOPA at that time, was able to get GARA across the finish line and defeat the trial lawyers, which was no small task whatsoever, and get it passed. And that really did allow the industry to continue, albeit, as we got into the late 70s and in the 80s with the Great Recession that we had at that time. You think about the oil embargo years during the Carter administration, and that the industry really took a big hit. And then it's ebbed and flowed and gradually recovered over time, but not to those levels that we had back in the 70s. So, things have, the marketplace goes up and down. I think that we as an industry have done a much better job of taking a look at the ebb and flow of the economy and what it does to purchasing power for people to buy aircraft. And right now we've done a better job than we have in my 18 and a half years at GAMA of being able not to build up so rapidly to meet demand that when there is a downturn, we all of a sudden have massive layoffs and everything else. It's been a very logical way to build up the entire industry. And at the same time, we have some what I call governors on the industry, which are supply chain and labor challenges that have also put a governor on keeping us from growing too rapidly. And then obviously during a severe economic downturn, we would have to go and lay off a lot of people.
So Pete, in the U.S. supply chain for aviation, as we look ahead to AAM, a number of these vehicle platforms have the potential for scaling of production of the vehicles that is reminiscent of the type of scale that we saw in the middle of the 20th century. But what are you hearing from manufacturers in terms of what we will need to build up? What parts of the U.S. supply chain, whether in propulsion or in aerostructures or other areas, that we will need to scale up in order to be able to pull this off and have a really strong U.S. industrial leadership in the space going forward?
It is a big challenge, and especially if you look at, we have a lot of the automotive industry that is being very supportive of this AAM world that we're going to, but we also, our supply chain is somewhat different than the automotive supply chain. Now, sure, we use, there's a lot of aluminum, there's composites, we use carbon fiber fabric, things like that to be able to produce these aircraft. Most of them are going to be made of carbon fiber, so there's going to be a big demand on that. Electrical engines are a new area that, or electric motors really, and a lot of our companies that are in the AAM world are developing them themselves. But also you have power generation that's happening from traditional manufacturers, whether it's GE, Rolls, Pratt, Honeywell. All of those companies are all very much into this space of being able to develop it. Will it put a great demand on the supply chain? Absolutely. But with that are probably some very good things that hopefully the demand will be large enough to ease some of the ways that smaller suppliers can get into this, especially if they can look at it and say, okay, I want to be an aerospace supplier. I'm producing common parts for the AAM vehicles, but also if they're also providing common parts for business general aviation as long as commercial. Our ecosystem is relatively small, obviously, compared to automotive. And that's, so the more that we can get small suppliers that are organic to the U.S., or homegrown suppliers, into the whole marketplace. And, once they produce one widget for, let's say, the AAM sector, their capability, especially when we look at robotics and some of the CNC machines that we have out there, they can keep those machines running 24 hours a day, providing parts for the rest of the industry. So I see it as providing the demand out there that will allow people to invest in the supply side. And that can only be a good thing. Will we strain the supply system initially? Probably. But in the end, I think we will be stronger for it because we just grow the pie. And those that want to supply to the aerospace sector can get excited about the opportunity that they have out there to increase their supply, not only for the AAM side, but for business general aviation and commercial aviation and military.
This dovetails with a lot of discussion in the country about bringing manufacturing back to the United States, bringing that capacity and also capability. Do you see the hurdles as being cost and scale related, or do you also see areas where the U.S. has a deficiency in talent in the workforce, working with new manufacturing technologies, or where we need to catch up in terms of the technology itself and the capability to, produce, certain subcomponents at the same or superior level of quality versus what is available overseas today? What are you seeing from your perspective from manufacturers in the supply chain around those hurdles?
Well, I think that quality is not an issue. I mean, when you look at what you get from a quality piece of equipment, widget, whatever, if it's homegrown, the quality is generally good. I think it's the size of the labor force. Think about what happened during the pandemic. We are, as I said, a very small ecosystem in aviation, and all of a sudden, our commercial brethren were grounded. They weren't flying at all. Well, what does that do to a small company that's out there that had these very long-term commitments with Airbus or Boeing, and all of a sudden the airlines just basically stop buying things, stop doing repair work, schedule maintenance and things like that? I mean, everything ground to a halt. So a lot of these folks in the supply chain, which are on the end of this gigantic whip, just were driven out of business. And so now we've got to be able to reconstitute that with all of the demand that's out there. And it is something that hopefully people can look at from an investment standpoint and say, there is a pretty solid demand out there that I can feel comfortable to invest with. Now, one of the other issues that obviously we're facing right now is the rising interest rates make money more expensive to procure for investment than it was, 3-4 years ago. And so that does become a challenge, but having that surety of demand out there, I think can only be helpful to grow it. So I think the cost of money is a challenge, the labor force. But when you look at the amount of automation that we're using in a lot of our manufacturing facilities right now, and just what technology has been able to do to that sector, if we can make the investments and we can find the labor that know how to work these machines, it's a new ballgame. And that's why I'm very excited. And we as GAMA are very supportive of a lot of the programs in the trade sector, where a lot of these community colleges are really being able to have some model programs that show young people how to be able to use these machines to be able to build the parts and pieces that we need in the industry. And then there's apprentice programs out there that are pretty fascinating, where our companies are paying them a good wage to be able to apprentice at the company, but then also get their education on the sides in those trades. And then later on, as they become members of that company, if they do desire to go get their college degrees, companies are very willing to support that too, because there's such an effort to be able to keep that labor that's homegrown. So we see all of this coming together, and then you add to it the educational programs that our sister association like AOPA is doing, what we're trying to do with our design challenge and others to be able to bring to middle school, junior high, and high school, and then tie it in with like what NASA does at the college level, to be able to try to bring a workforce of the future into this industry to be able to provide all of that, the goods and services that we will need.
I recently came across an astonishing statistic that said that an OEM's liability insurance for each general aviation aircraft manufactured in the US rose from about $50 per airplane in the early 60s up to $100,000 per aircraft in the late 80s. This really had a chilling effect on the growth of the general aviation industry in the US. How do you see AAM potentially addressing this problem?
Well, we've had discussions with the insurance community, first of all, to let them understand this whole new sector. And obviously, we are having our challenges with just in business and general aviation now with insurance rates and insurance rates ebb and flow. The insurance industry will tell you that if you took normal inflationary factors into play, we're probably paying what we would have had increases happened at the rate of inflation from 20 years ago. With that said, the rapid rise in insurance rates have really hurt the industry, and we're obviously working with a lot of companies to be able to see what we can do about that, having logical discounts for appropriate type of training in that. So the challenges in the AAM world is first to have the insurers understand what these aircraft are, who's operating them, the degree of automation, the degree of redundancy, and the degree of rigor that the FAA and other regulatory authorities are going to put on these aircraft just to be able to let them not only be certified, but then operate, and put that all into the cauldron to be able to work the issue. So I don't have any answers about right now of what we would see the rates are they commensurate with what we see on the business aviation front and that. But I can just tell you that we're working with the insurance industries to try to understand the marketplace and to understand these aircraft.
Pete, talk a little bit about GAMA's comments to the FAA proposed SFAR.
Well, as we all know, when Administrator Dixon, well, even I'll go back even further, when Administrator Huerta was at the head of the FAA, and we passed the Small Aircraft Revitalization Act, SARA, which passed unanimously in the House and Senate, which is one of the few things that's done that in my recent memory. There was great support by Administrator Huerta to be able to push this forward of looking at, in the U.S., different ways to look at Part 23. And then our plan was to certify all these vehicles that had any type of wing form on them and certify them with aircraft with special conditions that accounted for the fact that some of them would land and take off vertically. We went forward with that. Administrator Dixon kept that whole philosophy moving forward. But when he left, the FAA changed direction and decided to go with this powered lift category. And what was striking to all of us is that there was rulemaking underway that actually had been given what's called a RIN number, a rulemaking indoctrination number, I think is what RIN stands for. But anyway, that was all going in there to do away with powered lift because there was no category in the ICAO about powered lift, and it didn't make any sense. However, through the bureaucratic processes with the FAA, I think specialists that had certain rice bowls got involved and pushed for this powered lift category to not only stay put, but then get expanded radically, which caused, in my mind, much more work for the FAA to be able to move forward because there are no operational rules available that are out there to allow powered lift aircraft into the airspace. So that really set the FAA on a path that they had to move rapidly to meet the commitments that the FAA also put forward, which was to have these aircraft introduced into the National Airspace System at the beginning of 2025. Those that follow rulemaking know that the rulemaking system within FAA and Department of Transportation up to the White House is just broken because we placed a lot of attention to it, as well as Congress has. There's been some good improvements that have happened recently in starting to look at rulemaking in a different way. But we all knew that it was a big task for the FAA to try to adopt this power lift and be able to have the operational rules to get them into the airspace. So that's what this SFAR is all about. And when it initially came out in its basic initial form that allowed us to comment on it a few weeks ago, we had some great problems with it because we don't think it was well thought out. One of the big issues in that proposed SFAR was the fact that to be able to qualify pilots, you'd have to have dual control aircraft. And that's a stupid and archaic way of looking at it in this day and age with how highly automated they are. And one of the things that we've been trying to do is get a lot of FAA people that are not pilots to be able to go and fly some of the simulators out there to figure out how, or to be able to see and witness firsthand how intuitive and simple they are to fly. They're just tremendously simple. And if we train people to be able to do many of the tasks that pilots do, of talking on the radios, being able to look for traffic, things like that, the actual flying part, stick and rudder skills, as we would commonly refer to them as pilots. These aircraft, a lot of them don't have the same type of flight controls, the ailerons, elevator, and rudder that we traditionally fly with. But to be able to require dual control aircraft is just, to me, a ridiculous requirement that technology has moved beyond that. And that's why an F-22 pilot or an F-35 pilot never see a dual control aircraft. They do it in the sims, and that's what we can do. And these are far less complex than all the things that you have to do to fly a high-speed fighter like that. So that's one of them. Another big one is just how we certify the simulators that we're going to use for this flight, because if the certification requires rulemaking, with as slow as rulemaking is, there's just no way that we can achieve the objective of getting the aircraft into the system in 2025. And the FAA recently doubled down on that commitment, because the FAA came forward with their Innovate 2028 program, and they publicized it, and they talk about operations for the Olympics in 2028 at, quote, at scale operations, which means at scale means that we've got these aircraft very prolific within the system into the National Airspace System, which doubles down on the need to be able to get them into the airspace by 2025. So those are some big things. The other things are looking at energy reserves. We feel very strongly on the energy reserve topic that we've got a lot of ways to look at these aircraft a little bit differently on energy reserves than obviously we do with fixed wing aircraft, but also potentially with helicopters, because of their ability to where they're going to fly and where they're able to put down if they do have a problem. So those areas are a lot of what we wanted to focus on. Some fire points on the operational rules also we wanted to touch on. So I'm encouraged. I'm very encouraged by the fact that David Bolter was named yesterday as the permanent head of safety of the FAA, because I respect David a lot. I think that as an operator, he's got the right way of looking at things. It's what worries me is just, will the FAA have the resources to be able to adjudicate all the comments that went in and be able to go ahead and get the final rule out in time for us to be able to capitalize it and get the aircraft into the system in 2025. So I'm looking forward to having dialogue within the rules that we have to when they get into rulemaking and ex parte, to be able to have at least have the FAA senior leadership listen to why we made the comments we did, so that hopefully when they get to the specialist level, that the specialists can understand where this new technology is able to take us.
Pete, can you unpack the energy reserves argument in a little bit more detail, and also take both sides of this argument, especially wearing your pilot hat?
Well, I think that when you look at energy reserves, there's so many things that you can look at in electrical aviation. Like when you and I fly a regular aircraft, let's just take a piston aircraft, until the last gallon of gas, until the last molecule of gas goes into the system, we get the amount of power that we want out of it. Where with electrical aviation, you're decreasing the level of energy throughout its course. But we will have guidelines of where you have to cut off and say that the aircraft is empty, and you'll have fuel reserves on top of that. Think about aircraft, especially in the initial phases that are flying VFR, to require them to have typical 30-minute reserve out there is just crazy, and it's not needed. And we're hopeful that the FAA looks at this and looks at a capability of, you can put these aircraft safely down in so many places, even in an urban environment, that you don't need those types of energy reserves, especially on aircraft that are very sensitive to energy, until we figure out, the Back to the Future flux capacitor or whatever, whatever comes on board. We're hoping that battery technology and hybrid technology improves along. But when you're doing this crawl, walk, run phase, to initially be requiring aircraft to have these tremendous reserves is not the smart way to approach this.
What is the right metric, in your view, that should define the reserve requirement, if not the 30 minutes?
Well, it may not be a universal a set standard. It may be a vehicle by vehicle based on its technology and, its weight, its size, those kind of things. So that's what we want to have a dialogue with the FAA about, because it may not be one size fits all, because these vehicles are so tremendously different. And if it's an STOL or CTOL versus a VTOL aircraft, there may be differences of what we want out there for electric and hybrid aviation. Also, where we draw the line that the battery's at zero, there is a capability that you can tap into a reserve within the battery that will harm the battery. But if you had an emergency situation, could you really access that energy in there, knowing that you're going to have to replace all the batteries, which obviously becomes a very costly endeavor? Those are things that we need to think about there as well. But we just want to have flexibility with the regulators to be able to talk about energy reserves in a different way.
How was the 30-minute for VFR flight reserve? How was that born?
I don't know. I wish I knew, but that one I don't know the answer to.
Or what's the constituency that's pushing for the 30 minutes of reserve?
Well, I think it's what existed out there previously. Some people within the agency are picking fixed wing rules. Some people are picking helicopter rules. Some people want to have a hybrid of both of them. And some people want to look at them in a totally different way, because we're not talking about fuel. We're talking about electrical power, or, we're not talking about avgas or jet fuel.
Pete, you made some really good comments, standout comments at the Honeywell second annual Advanced Air Mobility Conference. Could you just give us some of those highlights?
Well, yeah, but I think, getting back to the situation that the FAA has put us into as an industry, it is incumbent upon the FAA to take care of the mess they created, basically. And if they do it smartly, if they listen to industry, if they understand the technology, they can do it. But if the forces of bureaucracy and this is the way we've always done it take root and take precedence, then they're not going to be able to achieve their objective, and they will have failed. And so I think that's probably some of the strongest statements that I made at the Honeywell Forum, is that they've got to be able to understand the technology and talk with industry, because quite frankly, you look at what's happened with the FAA right now. They've had a tremendous brain drain over the last few years. I can't understand when the President of the United States comes out and says, these people need to come back to work and quit working from home. And all of a sudden you have the unions balking at that. That's just unconscionable to me. These people need to be back in the office, collaborating with one another, understanding the technology to be able to move aviation forward.
So, Pete, how would you describe the relationship between the general aviation and the drone communities, and how has it evolved over the years?
First of all, we work very closely with the drone communities, the GA groups. I mean, we've gone to several forums at the White House with the UAS community, and the head of AUVSI, Brian Wynn's a good friend of mine, GA pilot, very passionate. Lee Solomon is the head of the Small Drone Alliance. And so we work together very often and speak on forums together. I think people make a big deal about the difference in how the BVLOS, the Beyond Visual Line of Sight ARC, actually the report that was produced, which was pretty much split between traditional manned aviation and the UAS community. And it was unfortunate at that time, from my perspective, that there just wasn't more time to arrive at consensus, because what I feel is that the manned community, especially general aviation, and in particular the rotorcraft community, that use the airspace below 400 feet much more often than obviously the airlines do when they're landing or taking off. That's the only time they're really spending much time down there. But it's GA that is affected with that airspace below 400 feet. We very much support the drone industry being able to develop down there, especially commercially. What we would like, because obviously we can't see the drones with the naked eye until you're right upon them, is an ability for the drones to be able to detect and avoid. And that technology has moved rapidly, as all technology does. But in that sector, there are some very cool solutions that are now being put on these machines. And the technology is fascinating. And the technology will benefit manned aviation. So we're very supportive. We work with the UAS community. And what we want to see on the man side is we want to see integration into the airspace. We don't want to see segregation. And we don't want the onus being on the pilot that has to rely on visual contact to be the one that's responsible for keeping us safe down there. And the technology's out there. It is, I'm understanding, somewhat controversial within the federal government of whether the FAA can share their surveillance data with UAS operators that are operating a UTM type of system. And that's concerning to me. And obviously, we all know about the concern over drones as we watch the war with Ukraine and Russia unfold. But at the same time, to not share the surveillance data with these users down there, I think is absolutely crazy. That could really help inform them when they do have a manned aircraft that's descending to or from a small airport or a large airport and things like that. That's one of the pieces that would help develop the UTM systems that are out there, because there's also a misperception by some people, even some of my friends in NATCA, that think that the controllers are going to be controlling the drones down at low altitude. And that's just not going to happen. There's not enough controllers, and there certainly is not enough capability in our system right now to deal with that many vehicles out there. So we've got to rely on a UTM system that then interfaces with our normal air traffic management system. And then by exception, the normal system will inform the UTM operators of those systems when we have a manned aircraft down in that airspace that needs to be avoided.
Do you think that the general aviation community should become electronically conspicuous to solve the drone industry's detect and avoid problem?
I think that there are low-cost solutions to ADS-B that could be employed by GA. But with that said, down at low altitude, is that going to be enough because of, line of sight and everything else that you have? And so I think that it's still, with what we have seen out there in, especially underneath the veil, the ADS-B veil, it's an easy problem to solve, because we know by exception any aircraft that doesn't have ADS-B has to be authorized to fly in there by the FAA, so that's a known player. Everybody else has ADS-B, and it's relatively easy for the UAS to avoid that. And that's really where a lot of the commercial activity is going to happen. Now, more so in rural America, and we care a lot about people that are doing crop dusting and the ag aviation community and things like that. They're integrating with drones right now. It's the ones that they aren't, that particular contractor is not integrating with, that can be the problem. So are there onboard solutions that can accommodate both communities? That's something we're all talking about right now. Low cost ones, there's ADS-B available in a low cost version for sailplanes and things like that. Is that enough to provide the detect and avoid capability for the drone to avoid the manned aircraft?
Pete, describe the cool technologies that you're referring to with UTM.
Yeah, I mean, NASA's done some great work on UTM. They use it in really showing its capability in a lot of the TFRs that are out there, the firefighting TFRs. But onboard systems for the UASs, very sophisticated low-cost LiDAR, acoustical ways to avoid, and then integration with a ground-based system that can be radar, can be very sophisticated optical scanning type of systems, but also then obviously ADS-B. So there's a lot of solutions, and it's not just one, it's a combination that can be used for these vehicles.
But you're advocating some kind of a ground-based radar that would play a part wherever UTM is deployed.
No, I would say that is one of the solutions, but does ground-based radar cover you down really at low altitude? Again, you have limitations down there at low altitude, but you've got ADS-B in a lot of those cases where the ADS-B may suffice enough for your detect and avoid. But we would want, where it's possible, to have that surveillance picture shared with the UTM operators.
Pete, just play out a little bit for our guests. We've had a couple of people talk about UTM. Play out for our guests how you see UTM being deployed and the interrelationship of the drones, the GA, and even get into ATM a little bit. But how do you see 5 years from now for the interrelationship of the three?
Well, we will have systems that are developed now, whether one system operating on a network of cell towers operates one proprietary system of drones, or whether you have a contractor. Take, for instance, like Embraer. We all know that Embraer provides the entire ATM network for down there in Brazil. If you had somebody like that was making their services available to multiple companies that have, are sharing the same type of platform to be able to communicate back and forth, it may be one UTM provider in a certain amount of airspace that then has an interface with the traditional FAA air traffic control system. There may be multiple players in the UTM space that communicate with one another. So the number of different possibilities are quite varied. But the important thing is that, we're able to go ahead and make sure that we have separation, that we use technology to be able to keep aircraft apart. But we also have to always think in 3 dimensions. It's too easy for people, and I see this on the AAM side too. They just think 2-dimensionally, and then not thinking about the freedom that you have with that 3rd dimension, where our problem is actually easier than it is for ground vehicles, autonomous ground vehicles, because we have that 3rd dimension of maneuver, which opens up tremendous more possibilities to avoid any type of close calls.
What's a realistic path to integrating drones into the national airspace system, and why is it that here we are in 2023 and this problem still hasn't been solved?
I think it's probably the reluctance or the slow nature by which we in aviation adopt new technology, because we are so much programmed toward zero tolerance for error. And that's not to say that we need to accept more risk on the commercial side or anything. I mean, it is a pretty good feeling that when you step onto an aircraft in the US or in Europe, you have the best probability of getting to where you're going safely than any other form of transportation that humankind has ever come up with. I mean, that's a good feeling. We wouldn't want anything to disturb that. But any time that you introduce something new that has any type of risk, that risk has to be looked at and mitigated to the greatest extent possible. And we're in just a new world. And so the regulators don't move quickly in that environment, not nearly as fast as the Congress or the industry would like them to. And it's incumbent upon industry to bring the regulator along, because we have the expertise. So we've got to train this very new workforce that's at the FAA that is also working in a lot of extent in certain in-flight standards, working from home, which makes it even more difficult to properly train them on this technology. So I think those are probably the biggest delays or impediments that exist out there.
We recently had Dan Elwell on. He talked about the FAA reauthorization. What are your thoughts?
First off, if we take the House side right now, the fact that both Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson are friends, they came into Congress together, they served on TNI, but also on armed services together, and from the get-go said, hey, there's not going to be drama in this committee. We're going to get our job done, and we're going to do it on time. That surprised everybody. It surprised the administration. The administration had talked a big game about having actually a reauth proposal, which hasn't been done for a long time. Well, they didn't get it done. and they didn't come forward with a reauth proposal, but the House executed very well to the extent that that vote, when the committee marked up, was unanimous. I mean, I had not seen that since I came to GAMA. I saw it when Senator Stevens, Senator Inouye were working together in appropriations back in my Air Force days. But it is pretty remarkable what they did. And when they got to the House floor, the vote was very strong. I mean, you had the fringes of both parties voting against it, which probably means your legislation was pretty good. And so that passed, and it passed much faster than the Senate or the administration ever expected. So now the Senate was all set to mark up their version, and we were very happy with what we knew of their version of the bill and what was to be marked up. But in the end game, we ended up having the controversy over the 1,500-hour rule and the slots at Reagan, the 65 to 67 age discussions all come in there. And quite frankly, I think now it's come down to a discussion between Senator Thune, very senior on the Commerce Committee, and Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, over how that's to be resolved. And it would be a shame, in my mind, for the country to not be able to get that resolved in a timely manner. Now, I'm being realistic. There's probably going to have to be an extension because obviously the current authorization runs out at the end of the fiscal year, so 30 September next month. So I would expect to see, hopefully, a short extension that culminates in a Senate bill that then can go to conference, that we can get it over the goal line, because there are some really strong things for the nation in the bills. And there's, at the same time you have reauthorization, you have appropriations working. So, and what we're seeing on the appropriation side is strong support in both the House and the Senate and their appropriations markups toward aviation vis-a-vis some of the other modes of transportation. And even with a very fiscally minded House right now, real strong support and similarities between the bills on the appropriation side. So, but some of the things that we were pushing for at GAMA, at the macro sense, in both bills, is trying to fix the problem with rulemaking right now. It's taken so long to get rules through the pipeline. And I think I mentioned earlier that we have seen the FAA make some changes in how they do rulemaking. But we also want to strengthen just the overall management within the agency itself. The fact that we have been without an FAA administrator for a while, we've had changes in the deputy administrator, both political appointees. We felt strongly, and the House really pushed this forward in their bill, to be able to establish a career individual as a deputy administrator for safety that is there to provide that type of continuity. They also chose to elevate the position of the head of rulemaking in the FAA to an assistant administrator level, which I think, again, is positive to raise the profile of rulemaking, because it's not just rulemaking itself. When we think of passing rules, it's policy guidance, those kind of things that go through a rulemaking process that start to make it very difficult to get through and time consuming. From a GAMA perspective, those areas become important, as does aviation workforce within the FAA, to strengthen that, to be able to give the FAA as much personnel flexibility as they can, to be able to hire especially engineering experts where their pay bands are competitive with other areas, but then also to make federal programs for developing the workforce for aviation apply to manufacturers as well as maintenance organizations and pilots. We think is a very strong message. And of course, in the House bill, they reauthorized the NTSB, and all of us in aviation are strong supporters of the great work that the NTSB does. On the Senate side, if you look at their bill, there is a lot of similarities with the House bill. They do have some variances on consumer protections for the airline experience, and that, which is somewhat controversial, I understand, with the commercial aviation side. But I think their bill is very it's a symbiotic bill along with the House side. So we're very bullish on both of them. We do have a GA title that Chairman Graves has pushed for on the House side, which obviously those of us in general business aviation are very supportive of. What's really neat in this new area of aviation is the strong support that we have in both bills for technology, for pushing advanced air mobility, and for pushing the previous subject we were talking about, UASs, to be able to be enter into service. So I'm very happy with those bills. We just got to get over the goal line of what Senator Thune and Senator Schumer are talking about in regards to whether it's the 1,500-hour rule, which, the political dynamics of that are very complicated because of the Colgan families that are supported by ALPA being able to push for no changes whatsoever. Senator Duckworth's firm position on that issue. As you saw on the House side, some minor changes to the 1,500-hour rule, allowing more time for simulator training, did not pass in the House as some of us would have hoped. And I think it's just become a very emotional issue that people don't look at the common sense logic, being able to do simulator training where you're working hard. Those of us that have been through dial a disaster many times in the sim know that you can do things in the simulator that you absolutely cannot do safely in the aircraft. And that time in the simulator of working on emergencies and doing some very complex flying is better training than what you get droning along on autopilot or what you would get in just burning holes in the sky as an young instructor pilot with no experience out there, which I think is one of the key issues we have to deal with as a nation. When a young person goes and gets their ticket, then they start to work on their commercial instrument, and then they start to work on their instructor. And it's a very cookie cutter approach at some of our training academies, rightfully so, and they have no experience and they're sitting in the right seat. So it just feeds on itself of the lack of experience that the instructor is translating to the new student. And we could be taking some of that time and using it more productively in working them hard in the simulator to be able to get that experience.
Dan Elwell advocated that all of 1,500 hours could be done in the simulator and come out to an advantaged outcome. What would you change about the 1,500-hour rule, Pete, if you could?
Well, I think just allowing more time to be logged in an appropriate level simulator than is currently out there would be a strong change. And it could be incremental over time. We would have to also look at what are, a lot of people say, well, the airlines don't have more simulators available. Well, we're not talking about the airlines. We're talking about prior to getting to the airlines, to building up to that 1,500-hour rule. And I think there are very sophisticated training capabilities that we have, and we're only scratching the surface now, because as we bring on virtual reality simulator training, it starts to lower the cost of simulators and enhance the experience. So there's some really neat things that are happening with simulator technology now that all the big training providers are on board with, and it'll only get better.
We recently quizzed or sent a survey out to our previous guests to give their opinion as to where we stand as a country as it relates to the regulatory and AAM versus the rest of the world. What are your thoughts, and how do you think we compare, and where are we favorable and where could we catch up?
Well, back to my previous comments on rulemaking, we are behind the Europeans right now in promulgating rules that deal with AAM and other areas like AI and things like that, just because of the nature of how we interpret the Administrative Procedures Act and how the FAA moves forward. And then obviously when Congress tells them to do something on rulemaking, other things that they should have done then start to get pushed further down the chain. So that puts us behind in the areas of AAM. But now you take the other side of the coin of the approach, if successful, with what hopefully the FAA does in the SFAR to enable getting these vehicles into the airspace. We have just such a tremendous advantage because we've got the largest, most complex airspace on the planet, and we know how to do this. And you think an AAM aircraft, if we use the crawl, walk, run analogy, as we start to put them into the airspace, controllers are going to get comfortable with them. We fly them in, I describe it to people as a tube, and the tubes flex. If we're changing runways at a major airport, the tubes may turn around or go in a different direction so that we don't have any conflicts. But once they get out of the inverted wedding cake out there and have freedom of movement within a Class B or Class C to be able to operate and go to, let's say, reliever airports. Our reliever airport infrastructure is so much more vast than any place else on the planet. And that's where it's easier to dig up soil and dig up asphalt to be able to install the electrical lines needed for recharge there than it is into a metropolitan area where you have to get on a much longer public utilities plan to be able to lay down the lines that you would need. So in my mind, I think we're really going to see a greater utilization of a lot of our reliever airports and our public use airports that are out there in the near future. And I'm very excited about that. And, take, for instance, Santa Monica. It looked like, we tried to make this argument when all the changes by the city council was being taken at Santa Monica, and it looked like the airport was going to totally close. And now I'm hearing positively that they're finally listening to the argument that, hey, with the advance of advanced air mobility, Santa Monica may be a prime location where we can solve a lot of the commuter issues that you find in the LA basin. So I'm really encouraged by the way we look at this incredible infrastructure that we have in the U.S. and be able to think about how we can better utilize it for advanced air mobility.
Pete, what are you hearing from the general aviation manufacturers and community broadly that is top of mind for them? What are they most excited or concerned about?
Well, most excited about is continued growth of the industry. We just released our Q2 numbers today, and every segment is up, which we're very excited about in a healthy manner. Concerns always exist with the economy. Are we going to be able to avoid recession? Workforce, the availability of the workforce to be able to attract young people into our industry. And, we're working hard on obviously diversity in the workforce, but also one of the biggest things that has remained untapped is the number of females that we have in our workforce. And it's just, we've got to figure a way to appeal to young ladies early on in their educational profile to be able to say, hey, come to us, be part of the solution, the sustainability solutions that we're looking for. And so workforce is a big issue for us. And then, as we talked about earlier, the ongoing supply chain issues that we have out there. So those to me are the biggest challenges. Now in Europe, our challenges accelerate when you look at just some of the craziness that you see there with trying to hurt business aviation. And it's so short-sighted because business aviation, well, general and business aviation, is a technology incubator for all of aviation. We develop things in smaller aircraft that then proliferate up into commercial aircraft. One of our AAM companies the other day looked at how they're using wiring and have found a different way to use the wire strands to be able to move more electrons in a lighter weight capability. And we all know weight is a big issue for all of aviation. So things like that will proliferate across the industry. And in Europe, there's a tax going on daily toward business aviation, and it's just going to hurt everybody's sustainability journey if you disenfranchise business aviation. So, whether it's punitive taxes that they're putting on the industry, bans at some airports like Schiphol and others up in the Netherlands, lack of availability to get at sustainable aviation fuel or even to use book and claim. The taxonomy issues over there in Europe that basically tells investment firms, banks, and that unless you have basically total electric aircraft, you shouldn't invest in the industry. Those things are very, very dangerous. And so we're continuing to work with our colleagues and sister associations over in Europe to see what messages can appeal to the grass tops, you're never going to change the mind of the crazies. But to work with policymakers in that, to be able to make them understand how important general business aviation is to sustainability solutions for all of aviation, and try to drive home that point is really our big challenge.
All right, Pete, let's go to a kind of a bullet round if we could as we wrap it up. Next gen, success, yes or no? What was its greatest accomplishment?
I think next gen, if you look at it, is there an end state to next gen? For those of us that have been working it for so long, there never really was. It was always evolutionary change of air traffic management systems. So if you look at ADS-B, if you look at wake recategorization, if you look at simultaneous approaches to runways, the proliferation of GPS-based approaches, yes, it's been a success. Has it been as fast as we all wanted? No. Are the procurement systems for the FAA antiquated? Yes. It's very difficult to acquire new systems. I mean, it just bothers me to no end that we aren't allowing ADS-B feed to some of our towers that don't have a surveillance feed for some reason I don't understand. There's pluses and minuses to this. What I really think, though, that we have to do now is we have to think about what our air traffic control system is going to look like in the 2030s. And the term that the FAA has coined is the net-centric NAS. And if we're going to a net-centric NAS, when are we going to build our first center for the future? It just drives me crazy that we have 20 plus centers around the country that we don't need that many right now. And it's just very intense infrastructure there that we have to devote facility and maintenance dollars to, that we should be looking at what is the net-centric center of the 2030s look like, build one of them, and maybe at one of the existing locations or a new location, say, that's a model. Okay, how many do we really need out there? And then what kind of redundancy do we have? We're just scratching the surface on what we could do with the limited dollars that we have available.
What are the hurdles of scaling AAM that most investors and public don't really realize that you behind the scenes better understand?
Well, the speed with which the regulatory bodies can be able to allow, let's say, our movement from day VFR to night VFR, then to IMC, that could be an impediment depending upon how the regulators look at that and how we build up data to be able to provide the safety case. I think how the business case closes for a lot of these companies will determine how quickly investors will want to jump in more, how quickly these companies can start doing revenue flights, because it's going to, in a crawl, walk, run scenario, it takes a while to be able to get the network developed with enough vehicles that you can start making money off the proposal. So there's a lot of variables that are unknown out there, but I think there's such momentum built on this industry becoming a reality there. And a lot of work now is going toward, can we build batteries that have more power density that can service aviation? That means that they're lightweight. And, some of the recent announcements, Toyota had one recently. I'm curious to be able to learn more about what they're able to come up with, but hopefully this momentum will build more producers of battery technology out there to want to get into the game.
You said revenue flights for the AAM. What about profitable flights? There's a lot of people who say that they'll really only be profitable when we have full autonomy. What are your thoughts on that? And when do you think we'll have full autonomy?
I think autonomy will be incremental. Wisk may be one of the first ones out there with a fully autonomous aircraft. They're going to groundbreak in a lot of ways. And depending on what type of flying that we're doing, you look at reliable robotics right now, working with a fully autonomous caravan type of flights in the cargo sector. We most likely would probably see that first, and may see it on traditional aircraft that are modified with the capability to fly autonomously versus some of these new vehicles. I don't know how that's all going to develop, but obviously the sooner that we can get to some of that autonomy, the sooner the revenue case closes, because we all know that pilots are not cheap right now. And so this industry will develop first with the pilots, and then we will be able to prove the technology and its capability, and probably more in the cargo area first, and then we'll gain the safety experience with that to be able to prove that we can do this with passengers on board.
Pete, before we have a couple more closing questions, who does Pete Bunce listen to in aviation and aerospace?
My board members, and I don't say that sucking up to them. I say that because they are a tremendous resource for me. I mean, these are the captains of the industry. They're really smart people. And then, because I've got such great friends in the other GA associations, and I would say overall, all of the aviation industry, I listen to the leaders in there. We have just GA itself. We're on the phone normally twice a week, talking with each other. We are all friends. We socialize together, but we learn from each other. So those,
as long as you've been at GAMA, who've been a couple call outs in the industry that you mentioned to our guest?
Well, my chairmen have been mentors to me, whether it's, Joe Brown, Mark Burns, Mike Malafitano, Phil Straub. I hate to not bring any of, because there's been so many. Every one of my chairmen I've become personal friends with and learned so much from. Jack Pelton, one of them, he was one of my first chairmen when he was at Cessna. So each one of those individuals, because we work so closely, and I rotate chairman every year, I get the benefit of being able to see their leadership styles, but also just tap into their intellect. And it's been absolutely fantastic.
An entrepreneur walks up to you at a party and says, I need to invent something in the advanced air mobility space. Where would you point them? What advice would you give to him or her?
Actually, if they have already formed a company, I would say be an associate member of GAMA, and not because I need more members. It's because that's where they'll get exposure to the industry and how to learn what the latest, thinking is of this new exciting part of aviation is, and what the needs are. And that's really how we get, other than the traditional, traditional is not the right term, but other than the OEMs, the airframe manufacturers, we have so many members that have joined in the associate category, whether they're on battery technology or parachutes or, you name it, new types of avionics, and that they want to be part of it to learn what the requirements are out there. So, you take a forward thinker like Mark Bantine, who ran Jepson for many years, and you look at, he came to Apple and said, I think we can take all of these reams and reams of papers that we provide pilots on a routine basis that they have to plug and play into their charts and everything. I think we can all do it on an iPad. And look at how you revolutionized aviation. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And I'm very lucky to call him my closest friend, and to be able to take people like that have an idea, or Tyson Wise or Daniel Baker, whether it's ForeFlight or it's FlightAware, and create what they did. We have that type of talent out there. And that's why I always get so jazzed about the job that I have.
That's great. This has been terrific. Again, it's an honor that you're on the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to leave with our guests?
I think just spreading the word about the excitement that there is in their industry, in this industry. And one of the reasons that we all love it so much is because we love the people. And I can't think of a more rewarding industry that you could be a part of. As a representing manufacturers, we make things. That's cool. But all of us that can share in the freedom of flight and to enjoy this new era of technology that's coming on board, this is exciting stuff. And it's going to change the world. And we want young people to be a part of it. So if I could ask anybody to do anything, is just encourage young people and parents to be able to say, hey, look at aerospace, and encourage the younger generation to be a part of it.
You're an inspiring guy, a great leader in our industry, and a great American. Thanks, Pete.
I appreciate all you guys. Thanks for what you do, and thanks for helping us get the word out to the wider community, because we have a lot of education to do to the entire planet, actually, on what can happen here in the next few years. And if you can help us share the excitement, that is greatly appreciated.
Great. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you, guys.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.